Hi, and welcome to Beef Bootcamp. My name is Whitney Peck. In today's episode, we're joined by Extension Specialist Chris Teutsch to discuss the importance of managing your pasture for a young producer. Chris, thank you for joining me today. Would you mind giving a little bit of an introduction on how you got involved with UK Extension and Forages?
Sure. I'm Chris Teutsch. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center, located in Princeton, Kentucky. We have two state extension specialists, one located in Lexington, Ray Smith, and then I'm located in Western Kentucky. I joined the extension at the University of Kentucky in 2017. Prior to that, I was a forage extension specialist for 17 years at Virginia Tech.
Nice. So a lot of questions that we get as a beginner beef producer is, what do we do with the grass that we have? So one of the questions that we get is, what is a forage plan? So Chris, would you mind explaining to us what is a forage plan?
So a forage plan is a plan that helps you plan out the amount of forage that you're going to have throughout the year. So we've got to feed animals 365 days a year. So it's really important that we have a plan put together that's going to allow us to have grazing not only in the spring, in the fall, but also during the summer months. And then we have to have a conserved forage plan for the winter months. So most of us are going to feed some hay during the winter months. So having that planned out, understanding how much hay an animal needs and how much hay that we're going to need for the entire year is really important. It's also important to have a plan in place to deal with stresses during the system, like a drought stress is a common stress that we have in the forage system. So having some extra conserved forage or some extra pasture on hand for those short-term drought stresses is really an important part of the overall forage plan.
A lot of research with rotational grazing and stuff like that, and I feel like that would fit in your forage plan. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the best ways to improve the productivity of your pastures is to implement rotational stocking. It's often called other terms. There's adaptive management, there's rotational grazing, there's rotational stocking, there's management intensive grazing, but it all comes down to the fact that you want to rest your pastures between grazing events and manage how closely the animals are grazing that stand. And that's got some real benefits. So when we implement rotational stocking, we're resting pastures between grazing events, and we're also maintaining leaf area in that pasture. So we don't allow the animals to graze all the way to the ground, but we leave 4 to 5 inches of leaf area. That results in faster regrowth in those pastures. It also improves productivity of those pastures. We say that we increase productivity in the range of 30 to 40% just by implementing rotational grazing compared to continuous stocking. Also improves nutrient cycling in pastures. So when we take one large pasture and subdivide it into smaller pastures, we make the animals stay in a smaller pasture. They graze that forage there, then they deposit that dung and urine back onto that pasture in a much more uniform manner. The other thing that rotational grazing does that we don't talk enough about is improve the drought tolerance of pastures. So what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the soil surface. So if I graze a pasture really close and really frequently, it makes the root system smaller, and that makes that pasture more susceptible to drought stress. So rotational grazing is an important part of your drought management strategy.
So if a beginning beef producer was getting into rotational grazing, what are some key components that they would need to purchase?
So the key components to purchase for a rotational grazing system, I always recommend people start with some temporary fencing.
Okay.
So that would be like polywire, reels, some step-in posts, and then an energizer to charge that fence with.
Okay.
That can be either solar when you get started, but the best buy in energizers would be a plug-in type. You get the most power per dollar with the plug-in type. But having that rotational system, having that temporary fencing in that rotational system allows you to kind of establish where you want your permanent pastures to be. And if I don't like where I put that temporary fence, it's really easy to move. But if I go right into it and I build a permanent fence, then I'm kind of stuck with that permanent fence. So I always recommend starting with the temporary fencing, kind of subdivide your pastures, see what's working in your system, And then after you kind of figure out where you want that permanent fence, you can go back and replace that temporary fencing with a permanent fence.
Okay, nice. So we've talked about grazing. What are some common plants here in Kentucky that we see in most pastures?
So we often think of pastures as monocultures, but really they're diverse mixtures of a lot of different things. Our primary pasture grass will be tall fescue, and love it or hate it, that's what we have, and it's really well adapted here. So we need to think about how we manage that tall fescue within grazing systems. So tall fescue is going to be the most productive grass that we have. It also can be infected with an endophyte. And that endophyte is a fungus that kind of lives between the plant cells. And it has a mutualistic relationship with the tall fescue plant. It gives it tolerance to stresses like drought and high temperatures and overgrazing. And in return, that fungus gets a place to live within that plant. But that relationship with the toxic endophyte causes lower animal performance. So calves will wean at a lower weight when grazing, when the cow and calf are grazing a toxic tall fescue pastures. So it costs the beef cattle industry in what we call the fescue belt, that are states like Virginia and North Carolina and southern Ohio and southern Indiana and Kentucky and Missouri. So kind of in the midsection of the United States. Out to Missouri, it costs the beef cattle industry about $1 billion a year in reduced gains. So it's a pretty big topic, and that brings us to another important pasture plant, and that's red clover. And red clover is one of our best adapted legumes in pastures. And legumes are plants that fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form. So they're an important part of grazing systems. They improve forage quality, improve animal performance, especially on tall fescue, and bring nitrogen into the system. So the air we're breathing right now is about 78% nitrogen gas, but it's not available to the plant. So what legumes do, they form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. In that relationship, the rhizobium bacteria take that nitrogen gas in the air and turn it into a plant available form and share it with the legume plant. And the legume plant in turn takes that nitrogen, and that nitrogen is shared indirectly with the rest of the plants in the pasture. So it's a really important part of a sustainable grazing system. The other thing that red clover does that we're just learning more about is that it actually reverses the negative impact of the endophyte in tall fescue. So that endophyte causes vasoconstriction in the animal. Red clover is a vasodilator, so it actually dilates the vascular system of the animal and helps to relieve tall fescue toxicosis. The third plant that I just want to mention real quick is white clover. That's a really important pasture legume also in transition zone states like Kentucky. And white clover is nice because it kind of has a growth habit that spreads out. So when I get like a little hole that's open in a pasture, the white clover can kind of spread into that hole. And when it spreads into that hole, it keeps things like weeds from growing in that open space.
So you just mentioned weeds. What are some weeds that the beginner beef producer needs to be aware of?
So I kind of want to step back for a minute and just talk about a weed control program.
Okay.
That a good weed control program is going to be what we call integrated weed control for pastures. It's a little bit different than a row crop situation. In a row crop situation, we're trying to kill all the weeds in the crop, and it's really easy to identify a weed because it's something that's not corn or soybeans, right? In a pasture, it gets a little bit more murky, and the way I define a weed in a pasture is something that the animal doesn't eat readily. So there's a lot of broadleaf plants or forbs that we call weedy forbs that animals will actually eat in a pasture. So that means that they're not really a weed per se, but kind of a forb in that system. There are weeds that animals don't eat, and there's perennial weeds like tall ironweed would be one, or horsemeal would be another one. And sometimes we have to apply herbicides to those weeds. But in general, we want to do things that promotes a really healthy and vigorous sod in that pasture. And when we have a healthy and vigorous sod, it doesn't leave a space for a weed. So where a lot of beginners will find a lot of weeds is around areas that were disturbed during the winter months during hay feeding. We'll see things like cockleburr and spiny amaranth and other summer annual weeds in those areas. And the best way to handle those summer annual weeds would be either a light application of 2,4-D when they're small, or even better, to plant something in that disturbed area like a summer annual grass. It could be a sorghum Sudan or a pearl millet or even a crabgrass. We commonly think of crabgrass as a weed, but it's actually a very good forage, and there's a number of named varieties of crabgrass.
Nice. So we've heard a lot of importance also about getting your soil tested for your pasture. You talk a little bit about the process of taking soil samples and where to send them.
Sure. So soil sampling is a really important part of the integrated pasture management program. So we have to have a basic level of soil fertility to really have a healthy pasture. So taking a soil sample is a great place to start. We want to sample each pasture individually, and we want those pasture units, their soil samples, to represent less than 20 acres. And we want you to have about 20 soil cores. And so make sure and use a soil probe when you sample your pastures. They're available at your local extension office to borrow in most cases. We want to sample to a depth of 4 inches. A lot of people don't understand that, but our soil sample calculations are calibrated for 4-inch sampling depth. So it's important that we don't go 6 or 2. We want to really be at 4 inches. Once you collect your sample, you'll put it in a small bag and take it to your extension office, and then you need to make sure and have a unique name or ID on that sample. Do your paperwork with your local extension office, and then submit that sample to the University of Kentucky's soil testing lab.
Okay, nice. Are there any areas that we need to avoid when we're soil testing, like the bottom of a hill, the top of a hill?
That's a great question, Whitney. Yeah, there are areas we want to avoid, areas where animals congregate at.
Okay.
So around waters, around ponds, where you fed hay at last winter. Those are all areas where nutrients get concentrated because animals are urinating and defecating in those areas, and that makes those areas higher in fertility than most of the rest of the pasture. So we try to avoid those areas. You want to stay somewhere around 40 feet away from those areas if you can when you're sampling.
Okay, nice. So I know you've done a lot of work with fencing.
So we talked a little bit about temporary fencing, and that's a great place to start. That gives you a lot of flexibility for starting to make those subdivisions. One thing, a lot of people will come to a farm and they'll have some old woven wire around the perimeter of the farm. A great way to kind of utilize that older fencing and not have to make a big, large investment right up front if you don't have the money is to put one strand of a high tensile fence offset from that woven wire. So they make brackets that go on the woven wire that hold a high tensile wire about 10 to 12 inches away from that fence. And then we can electrify that one strand of high tensile wire that's about 30 inches off the ground. That's the nose height of the animal. That's where you want to shock the animal at. Then that protects that existing fence, and it also gives you a kind of an extension cord. I can connect anywhere on that offset wire with temporary fencing to further subdivide the pastures. That's a great way to get started. And then of course we've got woven wire fence that we can put up new, and we recommend the fixed knot high tensile woven wire fence. That's probably the best fence on the market at this time. And there's a number of different manufacturers of that fence, and most of the fences is pretty good. And then we have smooth high tensile fence. That's probably going to be the cheapest alternative. That would have to be electrified, and we can run that in multi-strands anywhere from depending if it's a subdivision fence, we could probably do 1 or 2 strands of high tensile. If it's a perimeter fence, then we'd want 4 to 6 strands of high tensile on the perimeter fence. That has to be electrified. That's really important because it's smooth. It doesn't have any barbs on it, so it has to be electrified. And then my least favorite type of fencing is barbed wire. It's hard to work with, and I know a lot of people still use it. And it can be an effective fence, but it's harder to maintain, and it's not really that much cheaper to put up than a good fixed knot woven wire fence. And we never want to electrify barbed wire fence, although I have seen some cases where people do that. Because the problem with electrifying is that you can get stuck in the barbs and then not be able to get away from the shocks.
So I know that UK and you've worked with a lot of extension programs that offer different fencing schools. Would you mind explaining a little bit about that?
Sure. So when you're just getting started, building a good fence can be difficult. Most people think they know how to build a good fence, but until you go to a real fencing school, you don't realize how bad your fences are. And I grew up on a farm where we had some pretty bad fences, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So we've got several fencing programs that we have. We hold 4 fencing schools a year, and they focus on putting up fixed knot woven wire fence, building braces. Building a strong brace assembly at the end of each fence is critical for having a long-lasting fence. And we're going to teach you how to build a fence that's going to last 20 to 30 years is our objective. And then erecting that fence or putting that fence material on is the important part. The fencing schools are good because they're partially in the classroom, so you can learn the kind of the theory behind putting a good fence up, but half of the day is spent out in the field with you actually having hands-on learning how to build a fence. Even if you decide that you're not going to build the fence yourself, you'll know what a good fence looks like when you're finished with this school. Most contractors do a pretty good job building fence, but there are some that do kind of a marginal job. So just having an idea what a really good fence looks like is pretty important when you're selecting a contractor.
That sounds pretty cool. Well, thank you, Chris, for joining me today.
Sure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Beef Bootcamp. Remember, after each video in this series, there's an opportunity to fill out an evaluation form. For every evaluation form that you fill out, your name will be put in a drawing to win a portable Blackstone grill. The deadline for that drawing is July 18th. If you fill out all the evaluation forms in the series, and there are 6 of them in this Beef Bootcamp series, you will automatically be receiving a UK Extension sorting flag. Thank you for watching.